Hello, Grace, and welcome back to Cover to Cover. Today we're covering Habakkuk 1 all the way through Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 7. As you may recall, the Hebrew Bible is sometimes called the Tanakh, which is an acronym made from three Hebrew words, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which are the three parts of the Hebrew Bible. The Torah, which is the first five books, the Nevi'im, which in English we would say the prophets, and then the Ketuvim, which are the writings or sometimes just everything else. Today we're concerned with the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and the prophets are further divided into two sections, the former prophets and the latter prophets. Interestingly, the Hebrew Bible, the books that compose the former prophets are Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The books of the Bible that Christians think of as the prophetic books compose what in the Hebrew Bible are called the latter prophets. So in the Hebrew Bible, the latter prophets consist of the three major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and a single scroll called the Book of the 12, which includes all of the 12 minor prophets. This arrangement kind of evokes a symbolic parallel with the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then also the 12 tribes of Israel. So you have, in some sense, a symbolic or a theological representation of the whole nation of Israel and their whole history just in the presentation of the prophets. Many scholars think that the books of the Bible are it's not just the books of the Bible that are sacred or the words on the page that are sacred, but even the arrangement, the canonical order, which is kind of arranged in a particular order to convey this symbolic or theological meaning. So what about Daniel? Lots of times we think of Daniel as one of the major prophets. In the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is found in the third section, the writings. So let's dig into Habakkuk. First, Habakkuk is not a typical oracle from God, but its first chapters are fashioned as a dialogue, and its literary genre is that of the lament. The phrase, "How long shall I cry for help?" in Habakkuk 1:2 is typical of laments. Habakkuk is trying to understand the problem of evil in the world, similar to the way Job or even Ecclesiastes works on it. But Habakkuk has this nuanced approach. The book begins with Habakkuk addressing God directly. He's complaining to God, and his complaint is one I have heard my whole life, and I expect you have heard it too. He asks, why are our leaders so corrupt? Why are politicians just so bad? And God, when are you going to do something about it? He is not just complaining about bad leaders, but leaders who claim to follow God. The instructions of the Bible are neglected, there's violence in the streets, and the laws pervert justice and oppose the righteous. God responds to Habakkuk in a very alarming way. God promises to bring Babylon to punish Israel. The mention of Babylon seems to place the timing of the book around 605 BC, after King Josiah's death. And at this time, Babylon had just won a decisive victory against the combined forces of Egypt and Assyria in the Battle of Carchemish. This battle is referenced in Jeremiah 46, 2 Chronicles 35, and also 2 Kings 23. Habakkuk is alarmed because the Babylonians are worse than Israel. Chapter 1 ends with Habakkuk's response to God, where he asks God, "How could you use such an evil people?" And then he waits for God to respond. So chapter 2 is God's response, and he does not admonish Habakkuk for asking the hard question. When God responds, he tells Habakkuk to write his words down, and he says he's going to make a promise to Habakkuk. And even though the promise will be a long time before it comes, it will be fulfilled. God promises that Babylon too will be judged, but even though God uses evil countries and rulers to accomplish his judgment, that does not mean he endorses them. The theological center of the book of Habakkuk is chapter 2, verse 4. As Israel waits for the promises of God to be fulfilled, God says to Habakkuk, "The just shall live by faithfulness." This verse is quoted in Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. And it's said that in each of these quotes, the emphasis is just a little bit different. In Romans, the emphasis is that we are justified by faith. In Galatians, the emphasis is that the just live and grow by faith. And in Hebrews, the quote precedes chapter 11's list of faithful witnesses. The righteous live by their faith. And in all of these, the word faith can also be translated as faithfulness. So we're talking about a continuing expression of faith. The verses can also reasonably refer not only to our faithfulness, but to God's own faithfulness towards us. Habakkuk ends with a prayer that may or may not have been composed at the same time as the first two chapters, but it's a fitting conclusion to the flow of the argument. Habakkuk anticipates the Babylonian conquest and begs God, "In wrath, please remember mercy." The chapter concludes with the opposite of what we might call prosperity gospel theology. It says, "Though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exalt in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer, and he makes me to tread upon the high places." As Habakkuk 3 echoes Psalm 18, this last verse there is replicated in Psalm 18. It's important to remember that the empires of Assyria and Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome, they're all gone, but God's people have remained. God has faithfully preserved them, and he will continue to do so. And that leads us to Zephaniah. Zephaniah is filled with imagery of apocalyptic judgment, and God states why he is judging Israel. First, they continue in idolatry, and Zephaniah wrote during the reign of Josiah, who we've heard in the previous lectures from Seth and from Brother Nathan, that Josiah found the book of the law and initiated a number of reforms. And there's this debate whether Zephaniah is writing before Josiah's reforms or whether the reforms didn't meaningfully spread to the whole nation. There is a possibility that the reforms were a kind of window dressing and that people performed the motions but kind of lacked the heart. In any case, Zephaniah does what Habakkuk and all the prophets do. He links idolatry with the lack of justice. In chapter 1, verses 8 through 13, the leaders dress in fancy clothes, they engage in violence and fraud, and we see the judgment of God specifically directed against their greed and their hoarding of property. But today's reading concludes, as the prophets so frequently conclude, with a promise to preserve a remnant and restore the fortunes of Israel. Verse 2:7 reads, "The seacoast shall become the possession of the remnant of the house of Judah, on which they shall pasture. And in the houses of Ashkelon they shall lie down at evening, for the Lord their God will be mindful of them and restore their fortunes." No matter how bleak things are, God always preserves a remnant, and he always holds the promise of restoration.